The other day, I got a question about whether most reading curriculums support things like executive functioning and metacognition. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about that and to talk about how you can evaluate the reading curriculum at your district or at your child's district to see if it's hitting all the bases that kids need in order to build solid comprehension and language skills. First of all, I'm Dudek-Brannan, and I help pediatric therapists be better leaders so that they can show up and serve their caseloads in a way that makes a ton of impact on their lives. And I also specialize in language and literacy, and I support SLPs in creating frameworks for their language therapy. So I wanted to talk about something that kind of goes in both categories today, which is just having an understanding of what components need to be there within a reading curriculum in order to support kids' reading skills, but also do it in a way that's going to help them to build problem-solving skills at the same time. So I have heard that, or I've heard a lot of criticism about curriculums in schools in general, that some of the curricular materials and some of the strategies there are not really supporting high-level problem-solving skills for the real world. And I think that that's a legitimate concern and question to be asking. However, I think that in a lot of cases, what's going on, it's not that it's bad, it's just that in some cases it's incomplete, or in some cases it might need to be tweaked. And many times, maybe all of the things that need to be there are there. It's just that we're using different terms to describe things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about reading curriculums and some of the conversations that are having and how you can tell, are we doing the things that kids need in order to build the skills that they need to have good problem-solving skills. So when it comes to reading comprehension, and this is for a lot of the professionals that I work with, they are in a place where they need to be supporting kids' language and literacy skills because kids are struggling with comprehension. And so it's really this chicken or egg debate where they are seeing that there are these kids struggling with comprehension. They can't inference, they can't state the main idea, they can't form a picture in their mind of what they're reading. So they hate reading, they don't like to do it. And because they're not reading, they're not building vocabulary and language skills at the same rate as their peers. And so it's kind of like, do we address the high-level comprehension issues, or do we address these issues at the word and sentence level, build vocabulary skills, or build the phonics skills? And where do we start? What do we do? Well, the quick and dirty answer is that we do need to hit it from both angles. How you do it and what your role is in the process kind of depends who you are. And it also depends where the child is in the process of their education. But I wanted to just kind of break down all the pieces that need to be there when it comes to building solid comprehension skills. So the thing that I see a lot of the speech pathologists that I work with doing is that they have students who are struggling with those high-level comprehension skills. And so they're working on inferencing and kids aren't getting it. And they're just kind of, again, working on it. The teachers are working on it. The special ed teachers are working on it. They're working on it, and it's not getting better. Well, that's because in a lot of cases, kids can't fully benefit from strategies focused on high-level comprehension, which does require executive functioning because you've got to have a strategy. You've got to be able to see the big picture. You've got to be able to visualize. Well, in order to be able to do that, you need the underlying language skills to be able to, engage in the internal dialogue and then also just process the content that you're reading. You do need a certain number of to know a certain percentage of the vocabulary in the passage that you're reading in order to be able to comprehend it. You need to know at least 90 to 95% of the words in that text. So if you don't, it's going to be hard for you to apply those high-level strategies if you don't know enough words, because it's just not going to make sense to you. You're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what words mean. You're going to have a hard time comprehending one sentence at a time. And then you also may have some issues with decoding. And then there's a cognitive load issue where it is kind of hard to process the big picture when you're having a hard time understanding individual words and sentences. So kids do need the underlying language skills in order to process the big picture. There's a ton of research to support this. So in many cases, if you're working on these high level things and you're not making progress, it's because they need some work on those underlying language skills. Now, does it mean that we stop working on the other things? No, it's just that somebody needs to come in and support these underlying language skills like vocabulary, syntax, semantics that are going to build that comprehension at the word and sentence level so that we can impact the other things. And in many cases for kids in the school age, they should have somebody else who's working on inferencing and problem solving as well. Sometimes that can be the same person and we're kind of cycling through different skills, but other times it can be two different people kind of dividing and conquering. So we do need to hit it from both angles. They're both important. And we need to understand that there's these different levels that kids need, and we need to kind of hit it from the 30,000 foot view. So big picture, high level cohesion, and we also need to really get into the minutia of words and sentences. So when it comes to the question of whether a lot of the reading curriculums and the strategies are addressing and building metacognition and giving kids strategies, you do have to kind of zoom in and see what kids are working on at the word and sentence level. And so here's what I mean by that. When we think about executive functioning, when we think about how we apply those skills to reading comprehension, writing as well, I'll just kind of go into reading specifically though, but we need to be able to, again, just kind of visualize a picture in our mind of what we're reading so that we can just get this vivid representation of what we're reading. So we need to have that mental image of what's happening. We need to physically see it. So it's kind of this multi-sensory experience in our heads. So that needs to happen. And then we also need to be applying strategies and thinking back, checking our comprehension, reflecting back. We need to have a strategy and sort of a plan of attack when we're reading a paragraph. This is true if we're reading something for enjoyment. And then we also need a strategy for if we're reading some kind of a nonfiction text and we're taking notes as well. So there's a lot of executive functioning in there. And those are just some brief examples. But the thing about that is that we also need to zoom further in. Those are kind of the zoomed out things that you need to do. We also need to be able to apply strategies for individual words and individual sentences. So with words, a lot of times, again, kids are not going to be able to do those high level things that I just mentioned if you don't have decoding strategies. So that's going to mean that kids need a lot of robust phonics instruction, and they also need other work beyond just phonics and phonological awareness. They also need some work in morphological awareness and morphological knowledge, because many words we can't just sound out, and look at one letter at a time. We have to look at the linguistic units in words, and kids have to have an awareness and a strategy for thinking about words in that way, because once you start to get to the later grades and kids are responsible for reading words that have multiple morphemes, they've got to be able to pay attention and have a strategy for cueing into those linguistic units of words. And so part of what reading curriculums need to do is teach those actual skills. So like what spelling patterns go with it, and how do we pronounce them? The correlation between and the relationship between orthographic symbols and sounds and phonemes. Kids need to actually learn content and skills to be able to decode words. They have to know those patterns. But in order for a reading curriculum to actually work, it can't just be about the patterns. We also have to embed strategy work and active use of language within those patterns. So one common example of how we might use a strategy when we are teaching phonics is that people will tell kids to sound it out. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to word that. There's a better way that you can explain the steps and the process. What you can do instead is say something like, think about the sounds, think about the letters. But that is an example of how you can embed work on executive functioning and metacognition into phonics. So now a lot of curriculums, in a lot of curricular materials, if you look at the materials, if you look at the worksheets and all the things that teachers are using, well, you don't necessarily know if they're addressing executive functioning. It depends more what you're doing with it. So it's not, you could look at that curriculum and say, you know what, this isn't really addressing executive functioning. It's not really giving kids strategies. Well, maybe, but part of what needs to be there is it's just, how do we use it? How do we teach kids to think about the letters, the sounds, the orthographic symbols? We need to just embed the right language and strategies on top of that. And so again, why a lot of people might criticize the way that reading instruction is done when you're just kind of looking at the materials, it really just depends on how it's being utilized. A lot of times it might be, partially correct, and we just need to add something on top of it so that we're getting that active use of language. Another thing that I've commonly seen within reading curriculums and when we're working on spelling is that kids just will have to kind of like write words over and over again or sort words, and there's not really a lot of active processing. So that's something where the act of sorting words and letters to make different spelling patterns and the act of writing words, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just incomplete. You need to be able to put something else on top of that to make kids really think through what they're doing. So for example, instead of just sorting the words, kids can be, you can tell kids, all right, think about those different parts of the words and what they mean. Say them out loud and pronounce them as you are sorting them, and be pronouncing the words. And then maybe let's use that word, and how would we use that word in a sentence? How would you say the word? So really embedding that vocalization on top of it is going to help kids to understand the pronunciation of words. And if we even do something else on top of that, that's going to help to get that active processing. So again, all of these things, even things like writing words over and over again, which just in itself is not a great thing to do. But if you have kids saying the words out loud, saying the sounds in the words as they're writing it, or, pay attention to the different, linguistic units in the word, or the spelling patterns in the words as they're writing it, and you're telling them and you're giving them some kind of a strategy to think about it while they're doing it, well, then it's going to be a lot more useful. So it's not that the things that are being done are bad. It's just that we need to make sure that we're doing these other things. So when we think about metacognition and strategies, we want to think about giving kids strategies at the word level. So I just mentioned some things at the word level. I mentioned things at kind of this high level problem solving level. And then something else that gets missed that I often work on with a lot of my SLPs is sentence level. And this is huge because syntax can make a big impact on comprehension. It can make a big impact on writing quality. When you have kids who have a hard time answering questions, especially WH questions, a lot of times it's because they don't have a solid sense of sentence structure. One of the really common things that tends to be difficult for kids with language issues is use of subordinate conjunctions in complex sentences. And a lot of these words, a lot of subordinate conjunctions are temporal. So if kids have a hard time with executive functioning and sensing time, it's going to be really important to work on those skills because there are a lot of temporal concepts in those sentences. And so kids, if we want to help them to be able to sense time, we need to be able to give them strategies and make it visual, but we also need to give them the language to explain that while we're doing that. So working on things like temporal conjunctions in complex sentences. So for example, words like before and after, like, before we ate dinner, we set the table, for example. So there's an example of a sentence with a conjunction in it. Those types of sentences tend to be harder for kids who have language processing issues. And so it makes it harder for them as they're reading something. A lot of times they might have a hard time comprehending one sentence at a time. And they also might have a hard time using those sentences. So if you ask them a question and the answer to the question requires them to use that sentence structure, they might say something that's not really what you asked. Or it could impact writing quality as well, because they might use a lot of really repetitive sentences, really simple sentence structure. So it's like they're not exactly making grammatical errors, but they're also not challenging themselves and using a lot of complex sentences. Or you could see where kids do a lot of these run-on sentences where it's like the whole paragraph is one sentence. So there's a lot going on there, but one really important thing that could be going on, that is a skill that you want to make sure that you hit, is syntax. Because if kids don't have an understanding of what a complete sentence is and what a clause is, then it's going to be hard for them to slow down and think about, like, where does my sentence end? Now, could it be also that there is an issue with attention to detail just as a whole? Of course, but if you want to teach kids to pay attention to details and focus and use strategies, you have to actually give them some specific strategies to use. So that's why sometimes kids who just have this sort of general work on inferencing and problem solving, it's not specific enough. It's not getting into the minutia enough and allowing them to apply strategies to specific skills, such as how to decode a word and how to figure out where your sentence ends. So you can't just go broad and general. A lot of times when kids are struggling with language, you actually have to teach them these specific language skills. And then the way that we embed metacognition is that, we're teaching kids a strategy for thinking about how to apply this skill. With executive functioning, it's the way that we learn it the best is in real life situations and in actual applied settings. So that means that if you are working on specific phonics skills, if you're working on writing, if you're working on sentence structure, that gives you a chance. That is an actual context where you could give kids a chance to apply a strategy. Now, that is, kids also need work with more functional things as well. But when we're talking about the language and executive functioning skills needed for reading and writing, this is going to be where they're going to actually need to apply those strategies. So we want to think about there's these vocabulary and these linguistic skills that kids actually need. We have skills. And then when you think about metacognition and executive functioning, it's all right, we're laying a strategy on top of these skills. And the way that I explain it to a lot of the speech pathologists that I work with is that a lot of times they're like, well, what words do my kids need to know? Like, where's my word list? And how do I know, like, can I give them a vocabulary assessment to know what words they do and don't know? Well, yeah, you do want to pay attention to the actual content of the words that you're choosing. Using tier 2 vocabulary from the curriculum is a good place to start. And if you have kids who really struggle with more abstract terms, then yes, you might want to start with more concrete things. But what you want to do is give kids strategies for thinking about words differently. So yes, you're actually doing some direct vocabulary instruction on categorization and describing words and using different sentence types and paying attention to the way that a sentence is structured, not just the content words, but also the function words in sentences, like the conjunctions. So yes, there are actual things that you want to focus on there and actual concepts and content that you want to focus on. But we want to think of that context or those content words and that vocabulary as words and concepts that we want to teach kids. But also the purpose of teaching kids vocabulary and teaching vocabulary words in therapy is not just because you want to get kids to memorize words. It's because you want to use that word as an opportunity to practice a strategy for thinking about words and learning words. So if you were to pick a couple words and you've got this huge word list and you want kids to learn all the words in the list, well, you're probably not going to have time to get kids to know all of those words. But what you can do is pick 2 or 3 of those words, teach kids how to study and think about words. And what that should do is over time, as you're practicing those strategies, you're getting kids to think about language differently so that they can start to actively process and self-question and think about things as they are reading, as they are reading, and they're realizing, like, I didn't understand that sentence, and they're thinking about it. And then they can also apply those strategies for the big, the whole paragraph as well. So we want to think about this when we're evaluating the curriculums, when we're evaluating, like, is this curriculum being used correctly, or does it include all the elements that kids need in order to build solid comprehension skills? We want to think about all these different levels. Are we teaching kids the skills and the content? So obviously grammar instruction, vocabulary instruction is going to be really important. But on top of that, Are we at all the different levels, like the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, the whole chapter, and getting the whole big picture? As we're working through all these levels and teaching these specific skills, are we continually giving kids the language and the ability to think through and self-talk throughout all of those levels? So again, where I often focused as an SLP was the word and sentence level, because that was kind of the missing piece for a lot of my students. But that was because within that context, I knew these other high-level skills are being addressed by the teachers. So I'm going to come in here and address the thing that's not being addressed. I'm thinking about it big picture before I'm thinking about what I do in my specific therapy sessions. And that's how I encourage people to think about it as well. But in general, with reading curriculums, do they address executive functioning? Do they address metacognition? Well, many times, just when you look at the actual curricular materials, you can't really tell, but they're teaching kids, they're presenting skills that kids need. It just depends, if they're actually having strategies embedded on top of them. So many times it's a matter of being not wrong, but incomplete, or being pretty close to where we want to be, but we just need some tweaks and fine tuning. And we also need to be communicating as a team to make sure that we're not, overlapping and having everybody teach one thing that is important, but then we're missing all these other things. So that's why it's really important to think about this big picture. So to learn more about the framework that I teach specifically, I know I've mentioned a lot of different things in this video, but one place you can start, I'm actually going to talk about my sentence structure guide. One of the things that is a big issue with comprehension and is often a missing piece when people need to actually know what skills do I actually teach my students and what are they actually missing that's causing an issue with their comprehension. There are some specific sentence structures that tend to be difficult for kids with language processing issues. And when we're trying to figure out what are the strategies that I teach and what do I get kids to think about, we need to actually know what, like, the content and the sentence structures that we're working on. So I talk about these in my ultimate guide to sentence structure, where I talk about some specific sentence types that tend to be an issue for kids with processing issues, including complex sentences. So to get that guide, what you're going to want to do is go to drkarenspeech.com/sentence structure, and you'll be able to download that free guide and get on my mailing list so that you can get more information about topics like this, such as reading curriculums and how to design effective services for kids. Again, to get that ultimate guide to sentence structure, you want to go to drkarenspeech.com/sentence